It feels a little strange giving a Dharma talk from down here in East Gippsland and not being in the Zendo. And thank you, Alex, for being in the Zendo and keeping the space happening for us. As I mentioned last week, we've added an extra sutra to our morning chanting, each day a different sutra after the Heart Sutra. And on Tuesdays, we've added of it today. And just as I was sitting, I was thinking that the name Song of the Trusting Mind is kind of interesting just in and of itself. Sometimes it's translated as trust in mind. It's a partial translation of a longer series of verses called the Xing Xing Ming by Kanchi Sosan, 6th and 7th century. And just that its title is Trust in Mind, or Song of the Trusting Mind, for me is an encouragement that when we get to know our minds really well, we can trust our minds. When we don't know our minds very well, maybe we can't trust them so well. Maybe they have too many delusions. We chase after them all over the place. But when we get to know our minds really well, we start to shed these delusive thoughts, dualistic thoughts that cause us distress, and then we can trust our mind. And I think mind here is not just talking about our personal individual mind, but mind itself, awareness itself, that when we get to know it, we can trust it. So just a little bit on the process of chanting and listening to these verses and songs and sutras is that they are often a kind of a condensation of much more complex teachings. They're abbreviations, or sort of poetic condensations of longer teachings, sometimes hundreds of pages long. Because of that, they don't explain themselves, because explaining is what takes lots of time. So when we read a line or hear a line, it's quite common to feel confused by it, or to maybe think this is contradictory. I've read somewhere else or heard somewhere else sort of totally the opposite, and now this is saying this and I've heard the opposite being said. So we can have confusion and sometimes even disagreement, like, that doesn't sound right to me. That doesn't sound right. I don't see how that would relieve suffering, or it doesn't seem right. So one thing that we can do is really just slow down and try and trust that there is a lot more subtlety in each of the words than maybe we notice at the start. And I think that applies to this particular song, that on first reading, it feels like it's making very sharp, absolute statements, but we need to unpack the words and realize that maybe the words are not quite as clear in their meaning as they appear at first. So the general attitude I try to take over the years when I come across something new in the teachings and it doesn't sit really easily with me, is I just say to myself, I don't understand what this is saying yet. I don't understand what this is saying yet. And that is having some trust that it's saying something useful, but I can't see what's useful yet. And it's also kind of expressing some confidence in myself that with practice and with time, that it will reveal itself to me and it will make sense. Oh, I've just got someone wondering if they can join the talk. So let me just text them and say yes. It's funny how our modern world. So that's just to suggest to you that if you're joining in morning Zazen and you're hearing some of these different chants, just to relax with them and be curious about the words. And another thing that we can do is when we hear something and it sounds contradictory or it doesn't sound life-affirming in some way, it feels harsh or something like that, to really be curious about what could this word mean or what could this phrase mean? How could I make this phrase seem like it's a beneficial phrase? And it's not to have a kind of blind faith in things. It's to have kind of an intelligent faith, faith where we bring our intelligence to it. And we can inquire, we can ask teachers and we can ask other Sangha members, what do you make of this? So with that in mind, let's look a little bit at this sutra. So the first line is, the great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. And the great way is maybe another way of saying an awakened mind, a realized mind, a compassionate and wise mind, compassionate and wise way. So someone with that kind of mind, it says the great way, when you have that kind of mind, the great way is it's not difficult if you hold no preferences. And just a little thought about not difficult. I think generally when we read this line, and I think this is accurate, we assume not difficult is a positive thing, which I think is what the intention of the line is. The great way is not difficult. But nice for us to notice that we make that assumption that not difficult is a positive thing. Just interesting for us to notice that. Because in other circumstances, we do say, yes, this is a difficult path. It isn't easy. When people say, but it's not easy to love everyone, we say, that's right, it's not easy. The Bodhisattva path is a challenging path. It's not an easy path. So part of our practice says it isn't easy, and that's a good thing that it's not easy. The discipline of daily Zazen is not always easy. Upholding the sutra, not the sutras, upholding the precepts, it's not always easy. Sometimes we just want to follow our impulses and get annoyed with someone, and we catch ourselves and take a breath and think, how can I be more skillful right now? You know, it's not always easy. But in the bigger picture, it's definitely easier in the bigger picture. In the immediate, sometimes it's hard. In the bigger picture, a life of practice is a more equanimous and in that sense, easier life. In that sense. So the great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. So of course, here right in the first line, we have to examine, what does no preferences mean? It can't possibly mean literally no preferences. Clearly, just to be alive involves a huge number of preferences. To not be too hot, to not be too cold, to not be hungry, to not be tired, or not to be too tired. You know, we have all sorts of preferences just to look after our body. And these are clearly healthy preferences. I mean, the Buddha experimented with trying to have as close to no preference as possible. He did do that for a number of years, as we know, as an ascetic. Tried to get to the point of really having so few preferences that he was barely ever eating anything, barely sleeping, barely attending to his body at all. And he came to the conclusion, rightly so, that that was not the meaning of, that was not the way. That's not the great way. That was not the great way. Nevertheless, I think all of us, or many of us, have been very inspired by the fact that the Buddha did do that, even though we agree that that kind of asceticism isn't healthy. It was also very inspiring that he tried so hard and was so genuine in his quest that he would experience that level of sort of physical deprivation. But he decided in the end a middle path between zero preferences and having exactly what you want whenever you want, or trying to have exactly what you want whenever you want, that both those extremes are not the way. We also have preferences that are very healthy, that are more to do than with just our physical body, and that's the preferences that we have as part of our personality. You know, the type of person that we are means that we like to be with other people, maybe a little similar to us in certain ways, or we like our environment to look in a particular way. We have our own aesthetics of how we like to dress, how we like to have our space, whether we like warm weather or cool weather, what foods we like to eat, what music we might like to listen to, topics that we're interested in reading about or talking about. And these are all part of our personality, and as such, there is nothing wrong with having those types of preferences. So the no preferences is talking about something to do with quality of preferences rather than actual preferences. So the great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. So we need to really look at, well, what does no preferences actually mean then? If it's not referring to the simple and ordinary preferences that we all need just to have a conventionally wholesome life. And I just listed some of them that just came to mind. When we have a preference for something that's not possible, that probably is a bad idea. It's a bad idea to hold on to a preference if it's not possible. And we can think of all sorts of simple examples, but you go to the shop, you want to buy some fruit, and there isn't any of that type of fruit. Right at that moment is the perfect moment to go, okay, there's no apples, that's fine, I'll have plums, whatever it might be. You know, right at that moment, or you have a cup of tea and it tips over and spills and there's no opportunity to replace it. Right at that moment is the perfect moment to let go of the preference of having a cup of tea. If you're in a discussion with someone and you really want them to see your point of view because you think their point of view is harmful to them and harmful to others, but they don't want to see your point of view, that's the perfect moment to give up wanting them to see your point of view. And sometimes it can be very, very large things where we have to give up preferences. You know, people who are refugees, for example, they have to give up, at least temporarily, their preference to be in their home country. I mean, they can hold that they want to, in the big picture, return to their home country, let's say. But on that day, when there's no chance of returning to their home country, that's the moment to give up that preference and say, how do I make the best of this country that I'm in? How do I make the best of this circumstance that I'm in? So to have a preference when it's not possible is the type of preference that it would be good to let go of. It seems so incredibly obvious, and yet so many of us cause ourselves terrible suffering by holding on to a preference that's not possible. We do it a lot. Another preference that's good to let go of is one that's basically just not wholesome. A preference that's not good for you or not good for somebody else. And that's not always easy to discern and not always easy to let go of. We can see that very clearly with things like addiction, not just the classic addictions, but people maybe have a bit of an addiction to reading the news online too much or whatever it might be. We can see sometimes that something's not really wholesome, but it's hard to let go of our preference for it. But that's part of our practice, is to discern a preference that's not wholesome and see if we can let that preference go. We might need professional help sometimes to do that. It's not always something that practice in itself is enough. Sometimes professional help is needed to let a preference go that's not wholesome for ourselves or not wholesome for others. Like a tendency towards being argumentative, for example. Not wholesome for oneself, not wholesome for others. But it might take a little professional help to help understand, why do I like to argue? Why do I want people to see things my way so much? Might need some professional help. Some preferences, this is a little more subtle in terms of being practitioners. Some preferences we have are strengthening our sense of ourself as a separate entity and strengthening our sense of others as separate entities. And we might want to consider letting some of those preferences go. We have to look at it very closely. Is this thing that I'm doing, I don't know if I can think of a very obvious example, but maybe a competitiveness, maybe activity that has a strong competitive component to it. We might want to just check, is this reinforcing my sense of needing to be better than others, for example? Or not, maybe not. Maybe we can do something competitive, but really the competition is within ourselves. It's more to do with wanting to be better within ourselves. There's nothing wrong with that at all. So maybe we could say in this line, the great way is not difficult for those who hold no preferences, that no preferences is not literally no preferences. It's this much more subtle examination of types of preferences. But it's easier just to say no preferences, and in many ways better, because it means that we, as practitioners, need to do the work to work out what does no preferences mean. So it's giving us an opportunity to make these teachings our own, to really take them in ourselves, to examine them ourselves. This is like why I like this sort of like intelligent trust. We have to do the work ourselves, but we're trusting that the work is worth doing. And maybe one other point on is that we can just be aware of too is how flexible we are with our preferences. Having a preference and then circumstances shifting, and then being able to shift and let go of one preference and then be quite happy to accept an alternative. And that I think often happens when we're working with other people. We had this idea that we're going to do this thing, but then someone in the group wants to do that thing. And can we just be very flexible to go, yeah, I think that works. Yep, let's do that. Not always. Sometimes the right thing to do is to say, actually, I think we should stick with the original plan. There are times when that's a good idea too. So all of this is us looking closely at how wholesome are our preferences for ourselves and for others. Maybe one other thing too about preferences is it can be nice to experiment with just having less preferences. Just to experiment with maybe in a way living more simply. And that's part of our tradition generally. If you look through the centuries, many, many practitioners choose to live a much simpler life in terms of material possessions. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. Maybe not always so easy to do in the modern world, to simplify, but there's always places where we can simplify. And we can do that kind of joyfully. It doesn't have to be a kind of a stinginess, like, oh no, I'm not going to let myself, I don't know what, have peanut butter on my toast or something. It doesn't have to be stingy, but we can just see if we can maybe not be so fussed about what we eat. Maybe food is a very easy place to experiment with because we do it every day. We have so many choices and options, so it's a good place to work with, actually, to notice our relationship to it. But how many clothes we own, how we transport ourselves, to what degree do we participate in entertainment? It's all worth exploring. So then the next line is, when longing and aversion are both absent, everything becomes clear and undisguised. When longing and aversion are both absent, everything becomes clear and undisguised. So it's just opening up the word preferences a little bit, because preferences is all about desire and aversion. That's what preferences is about. So when there's, again, it's not saying zero desire and zero preferences, zero aversion and zero desire. It's like, how do we have a wholesome relationship to it? When we have a wholesome relationship, which is what I think it means by the word absent, it's another place where we have to examine what would this word absent mean, because absence not possible. So it's a middle way, a middle teaching of how we relate to desire and aversion. Everything becomes clear and undisguised. Instead of us being tossed around by our own emotional world, we can move through the world with a lot more grace and a lot more ease. And I wanted to read a koan, actually, from the Mumon Koan. This is, I don't refer to this version very often, but this is The Gateless Gate by Koan Yamada Roshi. It's a very well-known, sweet, simple, but rich koan. Case 16, The Sound of the Bell and the 7-Panel Robe. Yunmen said, "The world is vast and wide like this. Why do we put on our 7-panel robe at the sound of the bell?" The world is vast and wide. Why do we put on our robe at the sound of the bell? And I'll just read a little bit from the commentary. One day, Yunmen said, "The world is vast and wide like this. Why do we put on the 7-panel robe," which is the akesa, the brown robe that priests wear, upon hearing the sound of the bell? The world is very spacious, and when you open your eyes, the whole world comes into them. Nothing will interrupt your scene. At that moment, each one of you is one with the whole world. You are nothing else but the whole world, and the whole world is nothing other than you. When you have no consciousness of I, everything is yours. There is nothing that is not yours. That is what Yunmen meant when he said, the world is so vast and wide like this. The world is truly very spacious, and you are completely free of all restrictions. You can stand up, sit down, eat when you are hungry, lie down when you feel tired. You can do anything freely and at will. But why do monks, hearing the sound of the bell, put on their ceremonial robes and come to the hall? The robe is the outer robe worn by regular Buddhist priests. The rakusu, which I have one on right now, which many of us wear in the Zendo, is a kind of miniature akesa robe. Kesa were differentiated by the number of cloth panels sewn together. The 5-panel kesa is made of 5 strips of cloth and is the robe which monks wear for daily activities. The 7-panel kesa is a dress coat worn for minor ceremonies. Kesas which have 9 to 25 panels are for full dress occasions. Every morning in the monastery, when the appointed time comes, the bell is rung. Upon hearing it, the monks put on their 7-panel kesa and go to the hall to participate in the morning ceremony. But why? This why. It is the wonderful charm, the magical talisman, which brings a Zen student to enlightenment. This why is the miraculous means of putting away the why of reasoning with all its thoughts and ideas. And to pursue the why, you must surpass the why. When you hear the bell, you should know that the sound is empty in itself. When you put on the robe, you must realize that the action of putting it on, the robe, and you yourself are all totally void. Some of you are familiar with the last line of the meal chant, "We in this food and our eating are equally empty." If you can acknowledge this fact, you will realize that when you put on your robe, there is no reason or why to it. Why do you put on a suit and go out at 8 o'clock every morning? Why do you eat lunch at noon? Why do you go to bed at 10 in the evening? Why? Try to search out this why. There is no reason for the why in anything. When we stand up, there is no reason why. We just stand up. When we eat, we just eat without reason. When we put on the kesa, we just put it on. Our life is one continual just. I picked this koan and that piece of commentary because it kind of transcends sort of a cognitive relationship to preferences. It's just very straightforward. For us, it will be when the alarm goes off, we get up and get ready for Zazen. We don't even think about it too much in terms of preference or not preference. We can talk about it in terms of preference, like I don't quite want to get up, but I do want to do Zazen because I want to awaken and my preference is that I want to do this practice. We can think of it that way. And I do think of it that way sometimes. But I also like thinking of it without preference particularly at all. It's just time to do it. Just sit. Just turn up for the Dharma talk. Just start chanting the sutra. Like it said there, just. I think that's partly what it means in the line where it says everything becomes clear and undisguised. The whole process of preferences starts to become much softer and lighter and almost can kind of disappear. And there's just a movement, just moving through the day, just moving through the day without a lot of active deliberation about what do I want, what do I not want. Just move through the day. I think that happens with our practice over time. It gets more like that. All right, I think I'll finish there and see if there's any questions or comments from any of you.